Hello and welcome to this video tutorial series, Getting Started with Gluware. If you're taking the test drive, you'll be able to follow along using the instance set up for you. If you're interested in taking the test drive, go to gluware.com/test-drive and fill out the request. In this video, we're going to highlight the Config, Drift, and Audit app, kind of part 2 of this series, related specifically to Config Audit in this video. So when implementing automation, one of the most important starting points is to regularly audit your network devices for security risks to ensure that they're secure and compliant with industry standards and best practices. So we're going to dive into how Config Audit can help you automate that. So let's get started. I'm going to sign into this instance, demo.gluware.com, of Gluware with my credentials and get signed in. And Gluware is going to navigate me back into the last application I was in this case, Device Manager. I can tell by the label on the top left. I can verify the organization I'm in from this drop-down. I'm in this particular org. It's a multi-tenant setup, and I'm in one particular org, in this case called test-drive-pod1, and I can see my user setup and credentials here. Now I'm ready to navigate into the Config, Drift, and Audit application. So I use the left-hand menu here and select Config, Drift, and Audit. A quick reminder is that if this looks different from your setup, that you can drag and drop the order of the left nav menu. So let's go ahead and click on Config, Drift, and Audit. You can navigate directly into the Devices view or the Audit Policies view. We'll be using both, but let's just click on the main app navigation. Okay, so here we are in the Config, Drift, and Audit app. Again, you can tell by the top left label here. And again, there's consistency from the Device Manager to into the Config, Drift, and Audit app. Hopefully you're able to watch part 1 that highlighted Config, Drift. In Config, Drift, a couple quick things to recap is that with Config, Drift, and Audit, the lower half of the UI here is your Device Explorer, and that view can be changed. If we look at the Views tab, we can change over to the Audit Policy Explorer view. So if I click this navigation, it's going to show me the Audit Policy Explorer. This particular instance and org of Gluware has several audit policies already in it, and we're going to dive into that. But just to show you that we can use the View selector to navigate back over to the device view as well. So I can switch back and forth between Device Explorer and my Audit Policy Explorer. You also have similar icons on your lower left here to switch between those. And one other thing to quickly mention is if you somehow close out this window, maybe by mistake, or you want the full real estate, if you close out that window, you can bring it back by these icons below. So let's go back into my Device Explorer view. So when using this app, more focused on the audit functionality than the drift functionality, I do want to highlight that there's a couple things you're going to want to make sure are turned on in your column selector. So using the cog on your toolbar here, if you view your columns, you want to make sure that your audit status at a minimum is turned on. And I think it's helpful to have the audit on in terms of a date and time stamp. So from a focus standpoint, when we're using drift, we are looking at the capture status and the capture on. When we're looking at audit, we're looking at audit status and audit on. Now navigating back into the Policy Explorer, when I have audit policies in my system, I can start to engage with these, but let's quickly go over the actions that you have, and we will be using pretty much all of these in the demonstration. You have the option to create a new audit policy. We'll be demonstrating that in part 2. You have the ability to select an audit policy by clicking it and selecting clone. So if you have a policy that you want to build off of and create another version of it, but you don't want to start from scratch, you can clone your policy. You can import policies, which we're going to be showing, and you can export policies. So our import and export format is in JSON. So we're using JSON data modeling or data structure to structure the templates to import and export. And then you can always delete a audit policy as well. I would just be a little bit careful in that when you delete a policy, you're deleting all the related components of it. So let's just take a look at some of the related components. If I look at this particular audit on the top here, this is a Center of Internet Security, or CIS, benchmark. It was for iOS 15. And if I look at this policy and I scroll to the right, I have my permission level, my audit on, my audit by, my audit status, the devices in the policy, the number of devices that were audited, the number passed, number failed, skipped, errored. So I get some summary level statistics, including the violation count and updated on and who did it. So again, top level statistics. If I double click into this policy, in this case it has been run, so it's going to navigate me into this is a results view, and let me clear this filter. So when you're double clicked into an audit, you have various views across the top here. Your top left view will be the details of the policy itself, and so we're going to get into this, but your policy is going to have a name, it's going to have a description, it's going to have a permission level related to who is able to run it, levels 1 through 3, and that can be tied into your role-based access control. And then you're going to have your rules. So if we look at this and look at this particular rule here, if I scroll over to the right, I have options for the rule, including edit the rule, clone the rule, and delete the rule. If I click into edit the rule, it's going to open up your main UI component to go ahead and build rules. The premise of Config Audit is that you are building a policy that includes rules that look at the configuration or components of the configuration and then are performing an operation like it must contain it or it must not contain it. Basically, you have rules saying, this is a required component of the configuration, or this is a forbidden component. And you can also see that you can get pretty complex with simple rules, if then and if then else if you want conditionals. So when you're creating a new rule, you name it, you have a description that is optional. You're telling it what the source is. In this case, we're defaulting to the latest snapshot. You could also point the source to the default snapshot as well. Essentially with audits, you're kind of always wanting to audit the latest snapshot because you want to know what's on the device right now and what is its status. You then have a filter per rule for the operating system. You can tie in a concept item. A concept item is essentially also a filter. Gluware concept items are built in when you load in components. So if I was building this rule, which does happen to be for AAA, instead of looking at the entire configuration, I could have the concept item do a filter of the configuration. That is, if you know the Cisco syntax, you can do a show run and then pipe to include a selection. So a concept item can filter in runtime. It also can filter in a post run. So once we have the snapshot, we can apply the same sort of filter to pull out or filter out this particular section and apply the rule just to that section versus looking at the whole configuration. So there's some pros and cons to doing that. We won't kind of dive deep into that right now. But the more you use concept items in Gluware, and if you're using Gluware's config modeling, where you're also implementing configuration policy, meaning you're doing configuration management, not just auditing config, then it starts to get interesting to kind of match your rules and what your audits are with your policy and what you're enforcing. And that gives the ability to implement things like remediation or to ensure your policy is correct, not just telling you what is out of policy. So let's go ahead and remove that for now. That's kind of what you get, and then you have the ability to test the rule as well. We're not going to go deep into this, but let me go ahead and bring up the test rule dialog. So you can put in the test data. So this can be the entire config file, or this can be just the AAA component. And then you can run your rule. If we scroll down here, you can hit test and you can run your rule to see what's going to happen. So This is a very useful practice when building rules, and we'll take a look at that a little bit later when we're building a policy. So you may notice I just clicked on the top X and completely closed out of the view I am in. If that happens, just double click back on the policy and bring it up. What I do want to highlight though is if you are in your detailed view and you make any changes to your rules, you're going to have a save button and you're going to want to make sure you save it. If you edit a rule and then exit to this view and don't save, those rules will not be changed. But again, back to kind of a summary and an overview here is that this particular audit policy is made up a number of rules that is looking at required or forbidden configuration statements. So that's what your view here is on the details. On the next view, you get your execution summary. So I ran this audit several times and across different selections of devices just to demonstrate some results here. I see the name, the end time, who executed, the status, if it ran or not, the number of devices, the audited devices, the number skipped, violations, errors, total violations, and total rules. So if I was expecting a case where this was going to be a completely successful audit and not have any violations, I would not be happy because essentially all of my devices, my audited devices equal devices with violations. And if I want to see that next to each other, I can just drag and drop here. Also, I can see my total violations were relatively high. Again, we've had audits that have violations up into the thousands and maybe much, much higher than that. So with these historical runs, I can come over here and I can look at details like I can navigate back to the policy. I can view the logs. One point here, as I click into the log, this is the top level log of the benchmark itself. If you want to see the logs at the device level, what you need to do is switch back over to your device level here, Device Explorer. If I double click on a device, if I select any device, then and go into the logs, which are here, the logs, activities, I have detailed views of what's happened here. So when I executed, if I wanted to see my execution of the audit, then I see those logs here. So device level logs, you navigate into your device and you go back into your device level log. I'll close that window for now. Your audit policy level logs are here. Next, in this summary view, you have your device view. So if I'm looking at this and I want to understand or be reminded of what devices it ran against, I can click this view and it's going to show me all of the devices in my inventory that were run against in this case. So let me go back to my summary. Next is I can look at my results. These are your detailed results. And this particular audit, again, was run across 7 devices, and there are, I believe it was something like 37 rules that were run. And we had a lot of failures. But when I'm looking at this, I'm going to see all of the violations here that apply to this device, and as I scroll down, then I'll see the next device, Hub 2, and then this switch, and then Spoke 1. So I'll start to see all of those. One of the things I find very helpful here is to filter your view. One of the most useful filters for me is by device, because I want to start to understand on a device-by-device basis how they passed or failed or how they dealt with the audit. So one of the things I noticed here is as I'm looking across my devices, they have nearly the same exact count of failures. So I can say from a policy perspective, looking at, again, if I expand 1 here and I look at the failures, it's failing AAA, it's failing authentication across my access lines like my con lines, my V2Ys, and so on and so forth. It's failing AAA, it's failing exec timeout stuff. So from a security audit perspective, this particular device doesn't have good hygiene, good security standards based on the CIS audit. But if I were to fix the configuration from a policy standpoint and apply it across all of these devices, I could essentially fix this, systematically. So that's kind of what you're looking for when you're assessing the results of an audit. When you build an audit based on your own configurations in your company policy, you would expect to have pretty good results. When you take a third-party audit like CIS or DoD or something from NIST, chances are you're going to have a lot of audit violations, and then you have to understand those policies and understand how it best applies to your network and your configurations. So let's just finish going through the views here in that we just looked at the results. And again, one more thing to point out is that in my results view, you can download your results. When you download your results, you get a zip file that has 3 files in it. And we won't get deeply into that, but you get a summary file and you get a very detailed spreadsheet view as well. So basically, the views, some of the views that you get here, you essentially kind of get that. If I clear the filter here, you get that in essentially a CSV view. So that's my results. Next, I have my activities. And when I click on activities, this is activities specific to audit. It's not all. If I want to see all the activities on a device, again, you go to the device view. If you want to see all of the activities related to this benchmark, that's what I'm looking at here. So again, a reminder about context is that I'm navigated I was in a CIS benchmark and clicked in for the details on the top. If I double click in a device, now in this tab, these are device centric views. When I'm in this tab or this view, these are audit policy centric views. So it's just something to keep in mind. And that completes out that view here. So that really kind of, let's say, completes the overview in terms of when you navigate into Drift and Audit, you want to understand your device inventory, which you see from your Device Explorer. Then you navigate into your Policy Explorer. You're going to be taking an existing policy and running it, or you're going to be going into an existing policy and or creating a new policy. So you're building, you're editing your audit policies, then you're running them. Next, here in part 2, I want to get into how you would import a new policy, audit policy, and run it. So I can see here I have several examples in this instance of Gluware. And just to mention that Gluware does provide a bunch of examples. If you are a Gluware customer or gain access to our support, you can navigate into support.gluware.com. You can go into the Gluware provided examples section, and then you can navigate into audits. And there's a number of audits here that provide examples that include many of the ones you're seeing in here. So if I navigate in here to like the CIS for, let's say I'm running iOS Audit version 16, which I am, major version 16, I can come in here and I can download this audit in JSON. So I click download, and then I have it on my local system. Now let's jump into how we use the import and export functionality. So now that I have that JSON file on my local system, I just click on the import policy. This prompts me to drop the policy right here, or I can specify the file. So I have that right here on my desktop. I can just drag and drop this CIS benchmark here. It's been successfully imported, and I click OK. So this is very important because when you're working within a group of people or team, you're going to have company standard audits and policies, and you're going to want to make sure that you are using that in your different orgs and your different distributions of Gluware. Whoever's using Gluware has access to the standard policies and can import them into their system and use them. So the new one imported here is called Cisco iOS 16 Benchmark. This is a CIS specification, which stands for Center for Internet Security, or CIS. And if I just navigate over to their website, CIS is an organization. They do many things, but one of the things they do is create benchmarks. And benchmarks, the goal of it is that it is a consensus of the most common things you should do to minimize the attack surface of a device configuration. So as you may know, when you boot up a Cisco router or a Juniper router or a switch or a firewall, typically kind of everything is on. They don't come out of the box in, let's say, a lockdown mode. There's a lot of things that are turned on or opened up. So as you navigate into CIS and you look at, let's say, Gluware is focused on network. So if I look at the network device view, I can see that they have CIS benchmarks across Check Point and Cisco and Juniper and others. As you navigate into, let's say, Cisco, there are CIS benchmarks for the different major release versions. So in this case, I was showing you before iOS 15. Now we're going to be working with an iOS 16 example. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time in this session showing how you could take their specifications and build out the audits. We're going to look at a little bit of audit building. But for context perspective, I want you to understand that any standard configuration compliance definition could easily be built out and implemented in Gluware, and that we do provide many examples of that through our support.gluware.com website. So I've just imported Cisco iOS 16 benchmark. I'm going to double click on it to open up this particular benchmark and begin to look at the details of it. So here's the name. It talks about that this is created based on the CIS benchmarks for Cisco iOS 16, and it's got the version. If you remember back at the CIS website, it spells out the version and when that was published. And again, CIS is incrementing. So if you're going to follow CIS, which I will just say that when you think about regulatory frameworks in compliance, some of the major ones out there like PCI DSS, HIPAA, SOX, which is Sarbanes-Oxley, FedRAMP, and others often will have requirements for configuration, securing the configuration, and many of those refer to the CIS benchmarks as a requirement. So that's one of the reasons that you want to be well aware of this, is that, again, depending on the industry and the vertical your company's in, if we work with financials that are PCI DSS compliant, or we work with healthcare companies that have to be HIPAA compliant, this is probably a component that you're going to want to be aware of. So here we are, iOS 16 benchmark, and it's made up of all the rules. And so I can scroll down and see all the rules here, and I can look and detail of each rule. Can read the description. I could also have looked at the CIS document, and I can jump in and begin to look more detail at these rules. So again, this first one is around requiring AAA for authentication. And once you're in the rule browser, a nice little feature we have here is you can browse through your rules. So using the arrows, you can go up and down in your rules. So here, Rule 2 is also related to AAA authentication. The next rule is authentication enable default. And you can go on and browse through your rules that are in this audit. So now I have the audit. Now I want to run an audit. So when you want to run an audit, what you want to do is go to your devices, and you select one or more devices. So this happens to be an iOS-based audit. I can see these are all running version 16. One of them is the switch is running a different version from the CSRs, but these are all iOS version 16 devices, so I can go ahead and apply this. So I'm going to take these devices, and I'm going to choose the option to audit the configuration. So similar to what you saw in the drift operation, I have the name that will be used in the labeling and the logging. I can select my devices through selection, an applied filter, or all. So in the UI, I currently selected devices, so I can stay with that. I also could have used a filter. Filters are useful because if you define a filter and if there are devices being added or removed in your inventory, your filter will dynamically create that list to include them or exclude them. So filters can be helpful. And then sometimes you want to just run against all. Next is you have the option to capture a new snapshot, or we will run against the last snapshot. So the default behavior is to run against the latest snapshot. Your audit will run much faster because that configuration snapshot is already in the system. Next, you want to select which audit policy you're running. We just talked about we're going to run the Cisco iOS, the CIS benchmark for iOS 16. So I select my policy. So I can kick it off right away, or I can schedule it. And one of the things that I said in the beginning is that with auditing and also with drifting, they are elements that you want to continually run. You want to run them periodically, usually daily. And you certainly can run them, let's say, before and after changes as well. You may want to run it before a change to ensure you're compliant going into the change. Once you implemented a config change or operating system change, you're going to want to run it after to ensure you remain compliant. So running these scheduled are very good. Also incorporating them in your process automation, like using Network RPA, is also highly recommended. For our purposes here, let's go ahead and kick off the audit. And the runtime will depend. This is a fairly lengthy audit, but it also is only running against 7 devices, so it completed in just a few seconds. But I can see here in summary, there were a lot of violations. So let's go ahead into view results. So in my view results, now this is back to what I was showing you before, in that one of the things that is useful is you can group by the device. And so I can see a very quick summary across the devices that, again, I have very good consistency in my so-called audit failures, and that all of them had 41 violations. So that is a high number of violations. And this is where you would want to look at the configurations and understand why they're failing. But the other piece of it, as you dig into the audit rules, especially when you're picking up a third-party rule and trying to adopt it, there may be things that don't apply to your organization or to your devices. One simple example is that with my CSRs, there is no TTY line. So I potentially could just get rid of that. But let's take a little bit of a look at what you can see here in your results. As you're analyzing this, a very useful feature here, you can float over the violation view. And this is going to tell you very explicitly, your rule is it must contain AAA new model, and you are missing AAA new model. So you can kind of float through these and very just quickly see that the lines are missing. You also notice that some are looking at full configuration and some are looking at filtered configuration. So if I look at something like filtered configuration, if I look into that rule, basically for things like interfaces or connection lines where you want the engine to kind of look through the whole thing and maybe iterate through interfaces, you can filter to just look through that. That's something to consider as well, as when you're building out your rules, is do you want to assess the entire config, or are you giving the engine a focus area like the line cons or your Ethernet interfaces or whatever it may be? So I can scroll through here and again just very quickly see that there were a lot of failures, and if my goal in this environment was to be CIS compliant, I would have a lot of work to do to update the configurations to implement those changes. Again, I can download out my results. It will give me a summary level view and a detailed view that essentially is equivalent to this. Okay, so that really kind of wraps up part 2 here, which is around importing a policy and then executing that policy and then diving into the results and understanding what happened and what to do about it. Now let's look at the third part here, which is I'm going to close out that window. I'm going to navigate back to my Policy Explorer, and let's build a policy. What I want to highlight here is that Gluware takes a no-code approach, and that you really can just copy and paste CLI and use regex and account for auditing of your configurations. So let's go ahead and say create new policy. I'll call it company policy. So in the first example, we were looking at security related audits. Another key category is your company's standardized configurations. So I call that, loosely company policy. And another key area is you may want to create a policy that's based on ongoing threats and vulnerabilities. So if I'm using Cisco PCerts and NIST, I might want to take the CVEs and the PCerts issued and build rules that are looking through my configurations for those, as an example. So let's go ahead and create this one called company policy. Create. So this is company policy. I can just call it, version 1.0 because you might want to iterate, and you might want to date it. You might want to tie it to a specific internal document. This is our standard. This is our standard config for iOS routers. I could even say, v16. So a name, a description, permission level, I'll leave it 1, meaning kind of anyone can run it. And we're going to just start building rules. So I'm going to click Add Rule and begin to go into this dialog. So in this Add Rule, I'm going to start to build this out, but I want to build it out based on my configuration. So we're going to use a shortcut or maybe a power user tip. I'm going to navigate back to my device level view on the lower screen here. And let's go into one of my spoke devices here, spoke 1. Actually, I changed config on this one, so it might not be a good example of, let's say, a golden config. So let's double click on spoke 2 here. And here in this new tab, I can bring up the view of the configuration. So now I'm looking at the configuration. And let's start to build out my standards. So I'm going to just do a copy. And I'm going to do a paste. And this is going to be called name server, so domain name services. Let's say specifically I do want these IPs, I would leave them in. If I wanted a name server defined, but I didn't care specifically, I could use a wildcard here, which is a regex like a .star. So name server, the severity I'm going to say is major. If a name server is not defined, that could be a major issue. I'll do it off my latest snapshot. This is an iOS-based rule, so I will filter for my iOS and iOS XE related devices. I could tie it to a concept item, but for this example, I'm not going to. And then I don't have to define a scope. Again, a scope is going to focus in on an area of the configuration and allow you to iterate, like through interfaces or VTY lines and things like that. So for this type of example, statements in your global config, you don't need to add any more complexity. Let's go ahead and execute this test rule. So the test data, I'm going to just copy this in, and then I'm going to say test. By just copying, pasting in the config, we're going to apply the rule. We're going to look at the results, and you can see based on this, it matches. In this case, it's pretty obvious it's going to match because it was static CLI without any regex. Where it gets a little more interesting and what you're going to want to verify in your testing is that your regex is defined well, right? Like if you're using /strings or different fields using regex, you're going to want to make sure those are working well. So this is great. Let me just cancel out of my test. I'm happy with it. And I just hit back. So I'm back into my company policy. Keep in mind something very important, and you can see a star here. You can see a star up here, is this is not yet saved. So you periodically, I would recommend, consistently, you're going to want to go ahead and hit save because any changes that are not saved will be lost. So that's name server, but let's continue on with this. Let's jump back into my config of this device. And I'm going to tie this into the example we did with causing drift, which is, if you remember in the drift example, we added something in DNS server and we removed something related to NTP. So I'm going to select this NTP here and hit copy. Come back to my company policy, add a rule. So this is going to be NTP server, or just NTP configuration. I'll just leave it as NTP. And it's going to be latest snapshot. It's iOS XE. Again, if NTP is broken, it could be major, so I'll put it as major. You have different severities. I don't need to define a concept item or scope. I'm going to paste this into here, and this looks good. What I want to point out is you can add complexity. And complexity or flexibility is things like adding an if-then. Like if let's say in this example, let's say I had various regions. I could use a region through a custom field or a site, and I could call it, North America. So I could say, if it's in North America, I want this NTP configuration. If it's in South America, I want this NTP. So the if then and or if then else gives you a lot of flexibility in creating more complex rules to deal with situations that aren't as cut and dry, which is forbidden or required. It's more of a conditional. If this occurs, or if it exists here, or if then. So again, adds a lot of flexibility, but for the purpose of this demo and this particular use case, it's very straightforward in that it's just going to be this. So I'm happy with my rule. I hit back. Again, my policy has changed, so I go ahead and hit save. So you would build this out, and again, you can incorporate regex for variables and regex for things like AS numbers or VLANs or whatever it may be, IP addresses. You would just go through and build this out. So let's say I'm happy with this, and this is my company standard policy. So I'm going to now run it. So what I want to do is, again, I have my Device Explorer up. If I didn't, I could navigate over to it. I'm going to select all of my iOS devices here. I'm going to say run an audit policy. I'm going to, again, keep it to selection. I'm going to be running my company policy and hit start. And it's going to execute quickly, and I hit view results. So here in my results, I can see that if I just look at from a summary perspective, my hubs have an error, my switch has an error, and my spoke 1 has an error. So this, for me, this was expected in that I know all the spokes would, so the other spokes, 2, 3, and 4, no errors at all. So 3 devices passed. When I look at my hubs aren't properly configured, or aren't configured as with that NTP server. So if I look at my violation, I'm missing the NTP server configuration, and same as this one here. So this is where an if-then could come into play, where I could say, I could do a conditional, and if it's a spoke, if the host name contains spoke, then it should have this configuration. It's a good example where tying in a conditional could help fix that. Next is if I go down to my switch, this switch is pretty much used in this environment for upgrades and downgrades. I haven't been configuring it like as consistent as the other devices. So I can see that here it is failing the name server configuration, and it's failing the NTP configuration. So this switch is not configured for either of those. So again, if those were company standards and I expected them to be there, I would have to resolve this. As we get into config modeling, you'll see how you can automate your configuration and tie that into implementing policy and keeping your config policy consistent. So now that I've shown you really, again, the overview of config audit, I've shown you how to import a policy and run a policy as, let's say, a standard policy or something shared. I've also showed you how to jump in and build a policy from scratch and how it can be very easy copy and paste with a little bit of regex, and you can start auditing your network, in very powerful ways. So one last thing to cover here, as I did this in Drift in the Drift component, is you can navigate into your dashboard view. If I just go into my dashboard library, Gluware provides an example dashboard for Drift and Audit. So I'm going to just double click into my audits and Drift alerts. The dashboard's purpose is to really surface the data to give you actionable insight as to what happened, especially if you're running things like audits and drifts periodically, like scheduled. So when I come in the morning, or if I'm getting alerts, I'm going to want to look at this really quickly to get a top level summary. So I can see here I had audit violations. I can view over here in that there were 2 different policies that were run. I can see I can see summary level data, and this is a widget that's fully configurable. I can see how many ran, how many completed. So you get your kind of summary level data, and you can fully customize your dashboard and the widgets to present the data that you want to see. Next is if I navigate into the Data Explorer. Data Explorer, if I change the view over to my report templates, we have an example report for your Drift and Audit. So this is already preloaded in terms of a report template. You can go ahead and build out a report of any information that you want to see from our underlying database. So now I can click on the devices view, select my devices. Again, I'll organize them, I'll filter them by, and just select the iOS devices that have potentially been run. And I'm going to go ahead and run a report for Drift and Audit and hit run. So now it's going to mine the database and surface the information related to Drift and Audit and give you my summary. So I can scroll across here and see that certain devices passed, certain devices failed, what was last run, and get this information. And again, you can edit the data, present it how you want. You can have it emailed, you can have it downloaded, you can have this running a report running periodically. You can tie it into process automation and network RPA. So not only do you have the detailed level results in your app with related to Drift and Audit and downloading all those directly out of here, you have the visibility of the data in dashboard and customizable reports in Data Explorer. So this concludes the Getting Started with Gluware tutorial on Config Audit. Hopefully you have a good example here to get started quickly and you've been able to follow along if you're running the test drive. Again, thanks for your time.